das Johannahan. On ein Silberschüssel, I want the head of John on a silver tray, right? A platter. And of course, this drives Herod absolutely crazy. She is given the severed head of John the Baptist, which, by the way, actually means John is killed, right? That's kind of what happens when that happens. In any case, in that scene, as you can imagine, she ends up kissing. By the way, she was wearing a red outfit in that particular production of the opera. Normally, they dress Salome up in a white gown and make sure you get plenty of red dye all over as a result of this horrible kiss. They try to make it look as European as possible, basically. Totally the opposite of South Pacific, if you can imagine the difference. So what can you say that accounts for this difference in art between the two nations, Europe and America, rather? Well, part of it, I think, is pragmatism. And notice, by the way, since I mentioned Maleficent as a more recent rendition of Sleeping Beauty, that obviously our culture is changing. So really what I'm looking at is back to the 1880s, 1890s, 1900, 1910s. What kind of culture, what kind of art scene was there in the United States? And we were talking about James, and notice James is often thought of as primarily a psychologist, and his Principles of Psychology is considered to be really the most important book of pragmatism as a psychology book. It's not one that psychology students would study today, except maybe in a historical sense. The main thing about it, I would say, is that by then electricity was being used, and James in his laboratory had an electrical device, and he zapped people with voltage and discovered that changed their personalities when you did that. So he concluded that our brains are electrical. Contain electrical impulses.
Wouldn't you have to say the brain is the personality to make that? Like if the structure
It does
is the
become,
personality.
it does, in fact, I would say it probably wouldn't have originated only with James, because remember, we've got Hobbes and others that think of it as purely a physical, causal thing. But definitely with James, if it's a device that is being run by electricity in some way, then it certainly is a physical thing in the skull. But so you get psychology as a very practical branch of philosophy at that point. He is still a philosopher. He still writes other books that we consider in general philosophy, such as the varieties of religious experience, which I mentioned. Notice in philosophy he's focused on a social dialectic. So this is really very Hegelian in my interpretation of what's going on. Even though, and it's kind of interesting, in many places James critiques Hegel. Remember, he spent a lot of time studying psychology and philosophy in Germany himself, but nonetheless he critiques Hegel. And yet a philosopher who was an American from Germany, is that possible? I'll mention this guy. That's the picture you usually see of him. And the reason I'm especially familiar with him, really kind of surprised when I was a student. One of the assigned books, remember back then in college, people were assigned books. I remember going to the bookstore and you came home with stacks of books that you were going to have to read for the various courses. One of the books that I was required to read was his book on Hegel, and I read that, and my understanding of Hegel not only came from my teacher, but also from this particular author. And of course, much later I came to realize that Hegel is that kind of philosopher where there's lots of different interpretations, so my original interpretation really was his interpretation of Hegel. And so I realized, gee, he's really quite significant in what happened in my education. He also was the American who interpreted Nietzsche for many. As you can see, I and Thou, Faust. By the way, my very first explorer on ChatGPT, I asked ChatGPT about his translation of Goethe's Faust, and ChatGPT said, Walter Kaufmann never translated Faust. I was like, you dummy. Because if you just go to Wikipedia, this page actually, and you look it up, you can see he's right there. He's famous for a translation of Faust, as well as other things. So that clued me in that ChatGPT was not accurate. I do think that it's been learning, though, and I do think, and I critiqued it. I said, you dummy. Well, I didn't use that word, but I said, you dummy. Walter Kaufmann, of course, translated it, and then it wrote back and said, sorry for the mistake. Something like that. But in any case, Walter Kaufmann, and the reason I bring him up in this particular case is because while James often criticized Hegel, Kaufmann, in reading James, pointed out that James was actually closer in his philosophy to Hegel than Royce, who was a fan of Hegel. So you get, Josiah Royce, who I highlighted last class as a really good beautiful English, in philosophy. And I recommend reading him if you get the chance. And remember, the books are online for free. You don't have to go buy them. So Royce is a fan of Hegel. James criticizes Hegel, and yet you get someone like Kaufmann to come in and point out that actually James is closer to Hegel than Royce was, despite that kind of characteristic or whatever. And look at the kind of philosophy he talks about as pragmatism. It's social dialectic. That social dialectic is within individuals as much as between individuals. Remember the part that I highlighted when we looked at Hegel with the master-servant literature, that you get this ambiguous dialectic between consciousnesses, self-consciousnesses. And as a result, people can interpret it as what's going on in my own mind as I'm trying to make decisions, arguing with myself, or between two people, or between two groups, or it keeps expanding. It's consciousnesses in the flow of their thinking, their engagement, their dialectic. And so this social dialectic is within individuals as much as between individuals. It is multiple levels simultaneously. And that consists really of an awful lot of still contemporary American philosophy. Lots of individuals look at things and try to explore this very social dialectic and how it works and what we can expect from it. Consciousness is nothing other than the subjective experience. Feeling may be likened to a cross-section of the chain of nervous discharge. Remember, you thought that was electrical. Ascertaining the links already laid down and groping among the fresh ends presented to it for the one which seems to fit the case. And the varieties of religious experience testifies that we can experience union with something larger than ourselves, and in that union find our greatest peace. All that the facts require, says John Dewey. Oh no, I'm sorry. Dewey that's the next slide, actually. So James still says, all that the facts require is that the power should be both other and larger than our conscious selves. So that's James. Dewey is the youngest of the ones that I've talked about, born in 1859, 1952, Burlington, Vermont. I got to be there. That was where I studied for a summer at the Middlebury College. I had a Russian refresher course there. He got his BA degree from the University of Vermont in 1879. The same year that I think 2 or 3 of his brothers all graduated, and even though he was the youngest one, they all went to school together. Kind of an odd thing. He got his PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1884. Remember I mentioned that while he was there, that's where he came into contact with Charles Sanders Peirce. And then from there, and it was interesting because he had decided he wanted to be a philosopher, graduate with a philosophy degree. I don't know if that necessarily makes you a philosopher or not. But in any case, his advisors said, don't do it. You can't get a job teaching philosophy in any of our universities unless you're also a theologian. Because up until that point, really, the position of a philosophy professor in a university was usually given to a theologian, essentially. And by the way, in my own alma mater at the time I was there, I had a Presbyterian minister. The chair of the department was Presbyterian, so that's 2 Presbyterian ministers. I had an Episcopal minister, a priest. Episcopalians are priests. He was in the department teaching ethics, and he had a girlfriend, by the way, and was married, just so you know. I shouldn't say that yet because Dr. Thomas Platt is still alive. I don't want anybody to get him in trouble. But Dr. Struckmeyer was Presbyterian. Dr. Ayukas had been a Roman Catholic priest, but then gave that up as he went on. So quite a few ministers, priests in my own philosophy department. But Dewey graduated without being a theologian and got a job immediately, notice, at the University of Michigan, where he taught from 84 to 88. Then he took a better paying job at the University of Minnesota, but almost immediately the chair of the department at Michigan died, and he was invited to come back, and so he did as the chair of the University of Michigan. But then he moved to the University of Chicago, and this is where all sorts of things begin. He begins what was referred to as the laboratory school, or the activity school, and it was part of the philosophy department, but the goal of this philosophy educational program was for children, and it was based on his interpretation of Hegelian philosophy. If Hegel's right, and consciousness is a dialectical process, from a thesis to an antithesis to a synthesis, and that's your new thesis, and then it keeps going like that. Instead of teaching children by rote, which was the typical way that education was held at the time, he instead thought what you need is for kids in the school to be presented with problems and let them solve the problems. And then give them another problem and let them solve that problem. Give them another problem and let them solve that. It's a laboratory for kids to actually interact with problems. It required teachers to actually know a lot more about their students And so as this spread, it professionalized teachers, because teachers had to know a lot about child psychology. They had to understand at what level these children were ready, what kind of problems they needed in order to keep them interested and to get them working together as a team to solve these problems and so on. So there was an awful lot involved in this. Plus, it had to be age related. You don't want to have, as they typically did at the time, all the